In this video, we're going to look at how to make a French seam. A French seam is an iconic seam finish used to encase the raw edges in a seam so that it looks like a clean press seam on the inside as well on the exterior. This is a great encased seam for sheer fabrics, lightweight fabrics, any fabrics in which you might be able to see through. It also is just a good, really professionally finished looking seam finish. So this is this first step for a seam finish is to go ahead and sew your seam. Now it's a little bit of it goes a little bit against our grain because as you can see, I very purposely used a material that I have a clear right side and a clear wrong side to my fabric. And this is where the first step is so important. And the number of times that I've had to go back and redo this because I forget to do this simple first step. And that is that you are going to stitch your wrong sides together. Again, you're going to stitch your wrong sides together. So instead of putting your right sides together, the exterior together, we're going to lay it so that the inside of the garment is laying on top of itself. And then we are going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance from this edge. Now this is assuming that we have a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Even if I was to make a wider French seam, I still would stitch this first line at a 1/4 inch. And I'm back stitching at the beginning and the end. So it looks like I'm got a seam that is on the wrong side of my fabric. So our next step is to try to encase this so that my seam gets moved to the interior. So the next step is that I need to go ahead and trim down the seam allowance because when I stitch this, I do not want any edges from my first stitch line to be poking through my seam. And so we're going to trim this down to about 1/8 of an inch. And it's just a very clean trim. So there is my newly trimmed seam finish. And then I'm going to press it over to one side. So I'm pressing all my seam allowance, very gently tugging this so that my seam allowance is pressed all to one side. And you can see nice crisp line here. And then to be able to encase this, I'm now going to put my right sides together. And I'm going to press this right along where that seam is. So the seam should be laying right along the fold here. And we're going to press that down. And then our last step is to go through and stitch another 1/4 inch away. So it would have the seam line there. So if I use my ruler just to indicate where that goes. Now you may be asking, wait, you stitched at a 1/4 inch the first seam and you're stitching at 1/4 inch the second seam. What happened to my other 1/8 when I'm dealing with 5/8? Well, by the time that we've created some bulk and we folded this over, that actually somewhat encases that extra 1/8 in the fold over. So this does usually end up being right around perfect 5/8 of an inch, even though it seems like the math is slightly off. So then my next step would be to come through and we would pin this, making sure everything is caught in between. And then you're going to stitch it with a back stitch at the beginning and the end. And after we stitch that, you'd see that this is actually then going to be encased and we wouldn't see the raw edges. So if we look at our finished sample, we have our stitch line here and here. Our right sides are now together. And our last step is to determine which way we want our seam allowances pressed and then press it in that direction. So that is the beautiful French seam. As you can see, there's no raw edges exposed. Everything looks like it's been stitched inside this little tube. And on the exterior, we have a beautiful, clean seam.